ddlc panic, posted by /. Daniel closes his laptop for the night and closes the game without saying goodbye to Monica in the Monica After Story mod, like he always does, but he faintly hears his name called. Daniel. Huh? I must be hearing things. Maybe I'm more tired than I thought. Daniel puts his laptop away at his desk and lays down, covers up and falls asleep. 2:59, 3 a.m. Daniel wakes up from hearing a loud crash. Huh? What was that? Daniel grabs a pocket knife he keeps at his desk in case of an intruder and slowly opens the door and half asleep walks to the kitchen. As he walks down the stairs he hears another but more faint crashing sound and extends his knife to protect him. He gets to the kitchen and hears footsteps, so he turns on the light and Monica screams in surprise. This makes Daniel freak out and hold his knife up in defense. He notices and almost gets close to her, but then something in him tells him not to. She tries to get close to him, but he holds his knife up, thinking she's gonna hurt him. Wait, please, I'm not gonna hurt you. Monica explains how when she's threatened she has an alter ego that is extremely bloodthirsty. But Daniel fails to listen and just thinks she's lying to get his guard down. Please. Grrr. Please. You've got to believe me. Grrr. I'm telling the truth. Monica is cut off by her alter ego taking over. What the hell? Daniel tries to run away but trips and his knife goes flying. He tries to get back up but Monica pins him down. Daniel starts crying in fear. Please, don't eat me. You should have listened to her when you had the chance, because now there is no escaping me. She says that in a demonic sounding voice. Maybe I should have a taste. Monica puts her hand over his mouth so he can't scream for help and bites his neck. He tries to scream but he can't. Monica gets done drinking his blood from his neck and his face is covered in tears of fear. Ah, what's wrong? You scared? You didn't believe her when you had the chance. Grrr. Too bad. While taunting him, she growls loudly to scare him even further. She then lets go of his mouth, but then she moves to his legs and unhinges her jaw, showing many rows of impossibly sharp teeth. He screams in fear, but her demonic looking sharp tongue shoots out into his mouth to shut him up. Now with her sharp tongue piercing him and injecting a weird drug into his body, and this time, while he's crying, he starts crying blood instead. That'll just make you more delicious, you know. Monica then consumes his whole body. Daniel then wakes up in his bed. Babe, did you have that nightmare about me eating you again? Daniel looks and starts tearing up in fear. But Monica, in her normal form, reassures him nothing bad will happen. There, Daniel, don't worry, don't even have that form you always see in your dreams. I had that exercised out of me a long time ago, so no need to worry. Daniel starts crying, not from fear this time, and Monica comforts him till he feels better. They both fall asleep together and wake up the next day, go in for therapy to see why Daniel has those dreams. The next night, he has the same dream, but this time, Monica, monstrous nightmare form, possesses him to go into the room where he sees Monica, not the monster version, sleeping, and stabs her against his will. She then stabs him, and he wakes up, crying. Asylum. Serenity could hear the resounding echoes of her footsteps as she walked down the empty hallway, fighting a flinch as the sound of each footfall bounced back to her. For some reason the sound seemed harsher than she had ever remembered. Perhaps it was because she had grown used to the overwhelming silence that accompanied her stay in the asylum. Asylums were meant to be a refuge for those that needed it, though they were more like prisons, a mental and physical prison. For those that wanted most to escape, freedom was no longer considered to be an unalienable right. The wealthy could buy their freedoms while everyone else stuck to the strict regime that the government set forth, enforced by the seers. Through a touch, all of your thoughts were on display. Any ideas that didn't comply with the status quo could land you in an asylum, where they would attempt to correct your thoughts, bending you into the robots that filled the bustling cities. The asylum was completely empty now, as though it had been abandoned and forgotten. Serenity's first step out of the building seemed monumental. As a child, a seer had seen her free spirit and recommended that she should be locked away before her mind ran rampant. The thought that had given the young girl away was a bird in flight, spreading its wings and soaring on a gust of wind. The single image was symbolic of everything the government tried to suppress in its citizens. The city had less colour than she remembered. The sky was more grey than blue, and the grass long since covered in concrete. The trend reached out to the people as well. Their skin had adopted a lifeless grey tone. Their eyes stared forward unseeingly, continuing to look around. Serenity caught sight of her haggard appearance in the reflection of the shop window. She noticed she seemed older than she should be. It had seemed a short amount of time that she had been locked away, but the body she saw was not the one she remembered. She had expected the short, round and bright child of her memories. Instead, the vision that met her was a woman, hollowed out and spent. An overwhelming fear overtook her when she moved and saw the reflection twitch in response. "Excuse me, what is the date?" she frantically asked the person nearest to her. The man didn't act as though he had heard her at all, continuing on his gaze forward. Serenity continued frantically, trying to get the attentions of those around her, to no result. Finally, she reached out to grab a woman who was passing quickly. The woman's gaze quickly snapped to the frantic girl, and Serenity instantly let go, regretting her actions. The woman's eyes were dead. No emotion or thought could be seen. They locked gazes and stood for a moment before the woman let out an ear-piercing scream. Serenity stumbled back, covering her ears as she fell to her knees, with her eyes fixated on the strange scars surrounding the woman's open mouth. The marks were so unsettling that she closed her eyes in an attempt to block out both the image and the sound emanating from it. When the woman finally stopped shrieking and Serenity was able to effectively think again, she looked up only to find that she was surrounded by men. Before she had time to process what was happening, a needle was pressed into her neck and she felt consciousness slip away as the ground grew nearer. Upon awakening, it became obvious that she was not lying in the street. The smell of antiseptic was overwhelming, and she opened her eyes and peered around the bright room. It seemed as though she was bound to a table that was being held at an angle, so that it was slightly reclined from being vertical. Looking down, her eyes were immediately drawn to the leather straps across her body. Tearing her eyes from the fastenings, she caught the glint of silver in her peripheral vision. Looking for the source, her eyes fell on a metal tray with several medical instruments spread across the surface. However, it was hard for her to focus on anything other than the bloody scalpel. Adrenaline coursed through her veins and she started to open her mouth to scream, only to encounter resistance. Frantic, she tried to break free from the bands, but had no luck. She continued to fight until she heard a door opening somewhere behind her. "Ah, I see you're awake. It's a shame that I forgot to put the mirror up before I left, so you could admire my work. We couldn't have you getting loud while the process is going on. Makes it longer," said a man from the right behind her. She was unable to see him until he moved the mirror around so that it was beside her. However, the man was the furthest thing from her mind. When she peered into the mirror, her mouth had been sewn shut, blood still covering the surrounding area. Dread filled her as she stared, unable to form a response. "Like it so much that you're speechless, Just wait until you see the rest of you. True work of art this time around. It's really too bad that you won't be able to enjoy it," he said with a little laugh as he grabbed her head and straightened it so she was facing forward, stretching another leather band over her forehead to keep it in place. A screen flickered to life before her, and the room was filled with a sudden noise that she couldn't place. Instinctively, she closed her eyes, still fighting against her restraints. Now, watch like a good girl. I'd hate to have to open those pretty eyes of yours the hard way. Those scars would be out of place even here." The soft voice of the man whispered into her ear. Knowing that his would be the last voice she'd hear regardless of what choice she made, she opened her eyes and gazed into the screen. They widened as they took in the flickering images. Her struggles slowed until she lay limp against the bands. Gaze still fixed. Green light, posted by Inevitable Mixture 401. The old house on Olympic Avenue watched me menacingly every day as I walked to the bus stop. I always quickened my pace as I reached the old house, not wanting to remain too long in its sights. Its baleful aura made my arms break out in goose flesh, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention. As I made my way past it to the bus stop on the next corner, I tried not to meet the gaze of the hulking Cyclops. Its sickly green eye made me uncomfortable. A previous owner had replaced the porch bulb with a green one. It remained day after day, year after year, the green glow unable to chase back the shadows, the way the comforting yellow lights of the surrounding homes did. It must have been a pleasant shade of green once. No sane person would purposely choose such a disquieting colour. It was the greasy green of those quick skittering spiders that lurked in my kitchen when the weather turned, the fuzzy green that grew on the long forgotten leftovers in the deep recesses of my refrigerator, the slimy slick green film on my pond after weeks of neglect. The feeling of dread was always present though. It was the worst in the cold winter months. As I passed the house in darkness, both on my way to and from my office downtown, the house itself was timeless. Built a century ago in the 50s, developers bought up the surrounding farmland and hemmed in the old house on all sides with cookie-cutter ramblers thrown up quickly and cheaply to cash in on the baby boom and suburban migration. The stately old home must have seemed like a queen among her more common courtiers. Set back from the road with the ancient maple tree in the yard, now it sat empty and forgotten. Even the for sale sign taped to the window was faded and weather-worn. Each year that gnarled old maple disgorged its leaves across the unkempt yard as it leaned drunkenly toward the street. The house had been empty for at least 10 years. I had lived nearby. However, the state of decay implied it had fallen into disrepair much earlier. Once lush, the lawn was now hard scrabble. Only the hardiest weeds could find purchase there. They cracked walkway lurched and dipped where the maple's roots had forced their way underneath. The rotted porch sagged, the paint peeling like strips of mummified skin. I wondered why the power company hadn't cut off the power to that miasmic beacon, and how had that awful bulb not burned out years ago. As much as I tried to ignore the green light, I couldn't avoid it. Once I even made plans to take a different route to the bus stop, only to find myself walking past the old place again, as if in a dream from which I could not wake. Something changed one December evening. A pretty blonde sat on the bus stop bench as my bus pulled up to it. Her blue eyes met mine briefly as I walked down the steps, but when I stepped out, she was gone. I turned up my jacket's collar and steeled myself for my usual walk home. The weather had turned, and a biting wind prodded and poked at my thin coat, trying to find a seam or crease into which it could sink its icy fingers. I pulled my cap tighter and wrapped my arms around myself for warmth as I shuffled down the frozen sidewalk. Even with the bitter cold, I still shivered. As I neared the old house, I tried not to make eye contact with it, instead to keep my focus on the treacherous walkway ahead of me. But something compelled me to look. A dark silhouette watched me from inside the large window. Although the weak green light made it impossible to see the person's face, I realized that the battered for sale sign was no longer taped in the corner and wondered if someone had finally bought it. The silhouette hesitantly raised a thin hand and gave me an imperceptible wave. Before I had time to think, I waved back. Then a forceful blast of wind buffeted me, making my eyes water and almost dislodging my cap. When I looked again, the silhouette was gone. My sleep that night was fitful. My dreams came in a jumble of disconnected images, and I couldn't make sense of them. Vivid colours, all eventually bled into a pale, putrid green. I awoke in a snarl of blankets, exhausted and disorientated. I showered and dressed as my thoughts drifted back to the old house. I made my way to my bus stop. No light other than the pale green porch bulb shone from the old house. I saw no movement, nor did the silhouette from the previous night return to the window. I stood there watching for what felt like hours, though it could only have been a few minutes. When I finally turned to go, the biting wind had chapped my cheeks and lips. My fingers were numb despite my thin gloves. I boarded my bus and soon I was lost in my thoughts. The silhouette was waiting for me that night, and I stood transfixed, wondering why this person was staring out the curtainless window in the dark. My stomach clenched and I realised I'd been holding my breath. I took a couple of hesitant steps towards the house, but lost my nerve. I shouldn't be here, I thought. I blinked and the woman in the window was gone. I had already made up my mind that it was a woman, though I couldn't know for sure. Finally, I surrendered to the cold and turned for home. That night I dreamed of smooth waves of deep red that darkened to a russet brown soil that spilled over me until I awoke, gasping for air with my head pounding. The presence of the old house and the mysterious woman within repeatedly returned to me the following day, and I found I could not focus at work. A co-worker nearby was wearing an unusual perfume, and the scent agitated me. I made my excuses to my boss and feigned an oncoming illness. Mr. Townsend glanced up from his paperwork briefly, narrowing his eyes as if he possessed the ability to visually screen for disease vectors. After a moment, he silently shooed me away with a dismissive sweeping hand and buried his nose in his work again. A heavy cloud cover muted the daylight, yet I could see the house clearly from the sidewalk. The green porch light lacked the menace it projected in the dark, and I slowly made my way toward the run-down structure. I navigated the tilted concrete slabs of the front walkway, trying to avoid tripping over any upturned edge. The remains of the gravel drive showed no evidence of recent use. The clusters of unbroken, desiccated milkweed pushed up through the surface and disappeared from view around the back of the property. At the porch steps, I hesitated, wondering what had compelled me to come here. A voice in my head screamed at me to turn around, to walk back toward the street, to just go home. Even as I climbed the creaking stairs, the glass pane of the front door was loose in its moulding and rattled as I knocked on it. What would I say if they answered? "Hello, I'm from down the street," I thought. I just wanted to welcome you to the neighbourhood. It felt pretty lame, but it would have to do. But no one answered. I shaded my eyes and leaned against the glass to see inside, perhaps expecting to see a worn-out carpet or outdated wallpaper. However, the small window pane was filthy, and I could see no light within. I tried the knob and was surprised when it turned in my hand. The rusted hinges protested loudly as I pushed the door inward and, "Can I help you?" The voice startled a small yelp from my throat, and I turned around so quickly I almost stumbled off the sloping porch. A middle-aged man in a faded and flannel-lined denim coat stood looking at me expectantly. I'm from down the block," I stammered. All my confidence had drained away. "I just came to welcome you. This house is slated for demolition," he said, his expression of mixed concern and curiosity. "No one has lived here for more than 10 years. That explained why the for sale sign was gone, although it didn't explain the person I'd seen the night before. "Were you here last night?" I asked. The agent shook his head. "Sir, I'm telling you, the city condemned this place. Can't you read?" He pointed to a large yellow sign taped to the door, stating just that. I could swear that sign wasn't there when I'd climbed the steps. "There was no one here," he continued. "I saw a person, a woman, I think, in this window last night." The man took half a step back and reached for his cell phone, his face now angry. "Buddy, I told you there's no one here, and you're trespassing." He held up his phone and began to dial. Okay, I said, raising my hands in surrender. "I must have been mistaken. Sorry for the confusion." I retreated to the street, gave the house one last glance, then quickly headed off toward home. Just after midnight, I awoke in a cold sweat. Perhaps I was coming down with something after all. The remnants of another nightmare turned to wisps of smoke and faded into the familiar darkness of my bedroom, lit only by a greenish light emanating from just beyond my open bedroom door. I walked hesitantly toward the doorway, gripped by fear and momentarily paralysed by the green light that had somehow followed me home. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes and stepped out into the hallway. I could now see the glow coming from the kitchen, and I breathed a sigh of relief. It was nothing more than the small night light above the counter, the light no longer green as I approached it. My fixation on the old house was causing my mind and eyes to play tricks on me. Whatever had triggered my distress was robbing me of sleep and poisoning my thoughts. Determined, I strode back to the bedroom and dressed quickly. I grabbed my coat and hat on my way out and put them on as I walked briskly toward the old house. A light snow had begun to fall, blanketing everything in a crystalline whiteness and making the sidewalk slick under the trudge of my possessed feet. The neighbourhood was as quiet as a cemetery. No cars rolled by, no one was about. At such an early hour, minutes later I reached the house. Its familiar green light both beckoned me and dared me to enter. My legs felt weak and I considered abandoning this foolish quest and returning to my warm bed. I had come this far though, and I needed answers. The snow was falling, heavier now, piling up and obscuring the walkway. I could almost hear the sound of each snowflake landing around me, even as I heard each rapid beat of my heart in the blood pulsing in my ears. I took a step toward the old house, then faltered, slipped in the snow and fell to one knee before righting myself and pressing on toward the door atop a rickety porch. The window was empty. The house, as before, was dark, save for that incessant green glow. I turned the knob and pushed the door open, eliciting a louder scream from its hinges than I expected. I nervously looked up and down the block, but the falling snow prevented the sound from getting far. A musty, ripe smell assaulted my nose as I waited for my eyes to adjust to the dim light that spilled in from the porch. A quick flip of the switch to my left confirmed what I already suspected. Only the porch light was receiving power. A large gold-framed mirror hung in the wall, reflecting the green light deeper into the house. The carpet in the hallway was threadbare, perhaps as old as the house itself. In a large room off the hallway, wallpaper had begun to peel away from the walls. It bubbled and sagged under its own weight. Some animal had made its nest in a half-rotted sofa, and the husks of long-dead insects lay scattered about. With my eyes now accustomed to the darkened house, I quickly took in my surroundings, feeling a familiarity I hadn't expected. I recognised a pattern in the wallpaper, as if I'd seen it before. For reasons I couldn't explain, I knew the layout of the house as well as I knew my own. I walked from room to room, feeling more confident with each step. I stopped at the stairway leading to the second floor. Someone had spilled something here, something heavy and black, tar perhaps, or maybe paint. The substance spattered the walls and lower steps and pooled across the floor at the bottom of the stairway. The pale green light seeping in from the porch only intensified the inky spill, and the most significant part of the stain was like a bottomless hole, roughly cut into the floorboards. Something compelled me to touch it, though my better judgment tried to warn me against getting too close. Instead, I ran my fingers over the dark spots on the walls, feeling the noticeable change in texture, rough to smooth, smooth to rough. Still visible under a thin layer of dust, several large, dried drips trailed away toward the kitchen. I followed the trail of droplets across the chipped linoleum floor, past an old gas stove until they disappeared behind a bolted cellar door. The windowless cellar beyond was pitch black. What little light had accompanied me this far into the old house died. At the top of the steps leading down, I reached in my pocket for my cell phone and saw that the battery was low. I hadn't charged it earlier. I used the screen's pale light to find my way into the cellar. In a few steps, the musty smell of the house above was replaced with rot from below. On a shelf along one side of the earthen-walled room, the shriveled remains of potatoes, onions and squash sat alongside ruptured and blackened cans of expired food. Insects skittered away from my light as I panned around me, and I could hear the movement of some of the larger ones in a deeper darkness that my phone's weak light could not penetrate. I caught a faint trace of a new scent, a woman's perfume. Robert? I froze at the sound of my own name. The sound was almost imperceptible and may have only been the movement of insects. Still, I stepped further into the room and moved toward the back of the dank cellar, where my light revealed a shallow depression in the hard-packed dirt floor. A rusted shovel leaned against the earthen wall. Images flooded my mind now. Red lips, pale blue eyes, golden hair, a black leather skirt, a torn purple sweater, a silver knife covered in scarlet. Scarlet spread on the walls and the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Scarlet that dried to rust, then turned black in the sickly green light of the porch. I knew you'd come back. The voice came from the hole in front of me and the stairway behind simultaneously. I spun around trying to see in the weak light from my phone, but found nothing and no one there. Just the insects scrambling to remain in the dark. The voice came again. I've been waiting so long. I thought you'd forgotten me. I had forgotten all about Tanya, who lived in this old house. She inherited from her grandmother. Tanya, whose parents had died in a car crash when she was 10. Tanya, who had graduated from Skyline High School just a few blocks from here, who'd worked for a temp agency saving up for college, and rode the bus downtown. It was like the old song by the Hollies about the couple who met at a bus stop and shared an umbrella. Only with Tanya and me, it had been a crossword puzzle in the paper. We stuck up a conversation, and I felt genuine chemistry between us. We met every day at the same stop and sat together on the number 3 bus headed downtown. When the weather turned colder, we'd huddle together under the bus shelter for warmth. In the enclosed space, her perfume was intoxicating, and I found myself thinking about being with her all the time. After several weeks of this routine, Tanya invited me over for a home-cooked meal, and I naturally assumed it would lead to more. When it didn't, I tried to press the issue. I knew I should have stopped, should have listened to her, yet the more she resisted, the more excited I became. I don't know what came over me. I was no longer the rational, stable man I'd always tried to represent. I wasn't even me anymore. When she screamed at me and pushed me away, I laughed and grabbed her and pulled her even closer. Then she struck me with something heavy and my world spun. The next thing I knew, I was tossing the dirt over her lifeless body. By the time I got home that night, the wound on my head and the concussion I had suffered left me confused and questioning what had really happened to me. I convinced myself that I'd fallen and hit my head. That's all. It had all been a bad dream. There was no Tanya. There had never been a girl at the bus stop. The whole thing was just a product of a mild brain injury and my vivid, overly active imagination. I let myself believe my own lie, and I had walled away the painful memory and what I'd done for nearly 10 years. We have some unfinished business, Robert. Tanya's voice grew louder. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I felt a prickling on my skin and a sudden tightness in my chest. My breath came in short, wheezing bursts, as if a giant fist was squeezing me. I felt the bile rising in my throat. My breath became a fog as the room became colder and the screen from my phone dimmed, then went black. I pressed its buttons, but it remained dark and lifeless. In a moment of blind panic, I turned to run up the stairs, taking them two at a time, back to the kitchen, to the hallway, to the porch, and to safety. Halfway up, one of the rotted treads gave way, and I plunged into the space beneath. I landed awkwardly and heard a sickening cracking sound as a violent pain surged through my body. My left leg was pinned beneath me at an impossible angle, and I could feel something sharp protruding from my thigh. The leg of my jeans was wet, and warm blood was flowing across the fabric. "Help!" I cried out, my voice muffled by the earth surrounding the cellar. No one would hear me down here. "No," Tanya said, with a strange, forceful tone in her voice. "Did you hear me that time?" As my vision began to fade, I tried to peer up towards the open door at the top of the stairway. In the deep darkness, I heard the insects moving around me, as well as something larger above me. I could just make out the faintest green light. I found out later that a neighbour had heard a woman crying out that night in the old house and had called 911. I don't remember the paramedics pulling me out, and when I woke up in the hospital days later, there were two homicide detectives waiting to speak with me. They determined the body in the cellar had been there for almost a decade and had ruled me out as a suspect, but they wanted to know what I was doing in the cellar to begin with. I explained that I thought I heard someone in trouble and had fallen through the stairs when I went to investigate. This seems to satisfy them, and they left. I sold my house soon after and moved across town. I started volunteering at battered women's shelters, and the nightmares don't come as often. And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Thanks for listening. If you like scary stories, then don't forget to like and subscribe, as this really does help the channel. And if you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares. And follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.